Structure and sex ratio, two topics, and then I'll tell you about some bluebirds. And so let's get started with age structure. All right. This is the ratio of different age classes to each other at any given time. Other than annual species that are born and die in the same year. People tend to think about plants as being annuals, but can you give me some annual animals? Grasshoppers, lots of insects. All right, but if they're going to be around for more than a single year, so they're around for multiple years, then the population can be divided into three groups. So we got the pre-reproductive group at the bottom, reproductive group in the middle, and post-reproductive group at the top, and it's always in that order. So pre-reproductive at the bottom, reproductive in the middle, and post-reproductive at the top. So hopefully those words mean things to you, but pre-reproductive means they have not yet reached sexual maturity. Reproductive are the ones that are sexually mature. And then post-reproductive are no longer reproducing. All right, so that's our three groups. The ratio of one group to another can tell you a lot about what's happening in the population. And so the one that I have on this very first slide represents a population that has a wide base. It's got lots of pre-reproductive individuals. Generally, we would think of that as, in a wild population, we would think of that as a healthy population, a growing population. But there could be a situation in which you get a pyramid that looks like the one on the bottom of this slide, where you have very few pre-reproductive individuals and lots of post-reproductive individuals. And that can often tell you that there's a problem in the population. So to give you a practical example of this, when I was an undergraduate, I got a job trapping turtles at Reelfoot Lake. It was a partnership between UT Martin, the Tennessee Aquarium, and TWRA. And we were trapping turtles in a few different points around the lake, but specifically the Upper Blue Basin. Again, that one's pretty isolated. That's the furthest away from most of the human activity. And then in the ditches that run alongside the road there in Tiptonville, I don't know how familiar you are with the area, specifically the one that's right by, it used to be called Kiwanis Park. I think they call it Ninja Park now. It's got the ninja obstacles. It got hit pretty hard by the tornado. It's got a little walking trail, but it also has a little ditch right there. So we put traps down in there for turtles as well. And to give you a little background, when we were doing this project, it was still legal to catch turtles and sell them. And so in the spring, when the turtles were hatching, you would see people standing along the road with long-handled nets, scooping the turtles out so that they could sell them regularly. Like, that was a very, very popular activity. And as you might guess, they didn't like us so much because they knew we were looking at reproduction and the impact that was having on the reproduction of the turtles in the different areas of the lake. All right. And so what we found was up in Upper Blue Basin, the turtle populations look kind of like the top. They were pretty healthy. We didn't catch a lot of old turtles. I don't know if you've seen like the old turtles, but they get all melanistic and their toenails get kind of gnarled, and it's pretty easy to tell when they're a geriatric turtle. So we didn't really find very many. We found lots of little hatchlings. In order to have access to the area where we put our traps at Lower Blue Basin or Upper Blue Basin, you would have had to have at least a boat. You couldn't just stand on the side and catch them with a big long-handled net. And so you had to have more equipment to get to them. In the ditches, though, right there in Tiptonville, where you had high traffic, easy access, we found this type of age pyramid. We caught lots of really old, gnarled geriatric turtles that weren't really worth anything, and very few young turtles, because they were being removed from the population as fast as reproduction was happening. And of course, now you can't do that anymore. And it doesn't look that way anymore, it doesn't seem like. But that's to give you an example. So in that case, we knew there was a problem, not because of habitat change, that's a change for us, right? But specifically because they were being taken out for the pet trade. That was what the issue was. Here's another one looking at the US versus some other countries. I've always liked this one, even though it's gotten out of date, but I can't find a more recent one. So we'll talk about what it would look like today. This one is representing the growing, right, the expansive bottom pyramid, so that the pre-reproductive part of the population is quite large. The reproductive is healthy, the post-reproductive is the smallest part of the population. And this is what you would expect in a country like Kenya that's experiencing rapid population growth. In the United States, we still have a fairly large pre-reproductive and reproductive groups. This is considered to be slow growth. And then over here, where you have this pyramid that looks very straight, that's considered more like zero growth, which would be things like Italy, Norway, Sweden, places like that. All right. As you look at the United States, you'll notice that there's a bubble right here. All right, it's a little bit wider right there. Does it have a date that this is from? No. To help us out, if we looked at our population right now, this bubble is right here, would be right here now. Does that help? Does anybody know what that's representing? What generation does my mom belong to? Not me, I'm Gen X. She's a baby boomer, right? So what happened at the end of World War II?
Soldiers came home.
Yep, came home and we got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of babies. So right after World War II, which one of these pyramids would the U.S. look like?
Probably
This one, right? All right. And then when the baby boomers were in their prime, when they were reproductive, they were having their own babies, it would have looked like this. And then what's going to happen as they leave our population? It would look more like this, all right? And that tends to affect a lot of different things. So for example, when we put into place Social Security, our population looked like this. We had a very large working population, and Social Security, you pay into it now, and the money that you put in now pays for the people who are retired, and then when you retire, the people who are working pay for you. That's how it works. And so it wasn't a problem here. We have a strong amount, a good number of people working, and a very small retired population. And so we're generating plenty of revenue to finance Social Security, right? And then now what we have is we have a lot fewer people working, but a large number of retired. And so that's stressing the Social Security system. It's causing a lot of political angst. But if we were able to look far into the future, which we aren't, partly because of our political system rotates every 4 years, well, every 2 years if you're the House, we replace people quickly, and they have to be able to be elected. And so what they're campaigning on isn't 20 years from now, this is going to happen, right? It's what can I do for you right now is generally what happens in an election. But if you look out into the future, we'll get more into this type of situation. That's not going to clear up all the problems by any means, because we still won't have we're not going to have a huge base like this, but it would solve at least part of it, where we have so many baby boomers that are still drawing on Social Security currently. What it's doing for us is it's making it so that we can't retire until we're older, essentially. So if I want full benefits, I can't retire to 67, and it's likely for y'all that will be 70 or 72. I mean, that's what's happening right now. Okay. But don't get depressed. What I found was, here's my advice for you today. As soon as you get a job, start saving into your retirement accounts, because that's what I did. And so I met with my retirement person a couple weeks ago, and I can retire at 65, and I have plenty in my retirement account so that I don't have to draw Social Security until I'm 67, so I get my full benefits. So there are ways that you can still retire before you hit 70, if that's what it happens to be. Okay. Any questions about age structure, why it might be important? Okay, so it can tell you quite a lot about what's happening. Before we go to the next slide, the other thing that's represented in this picture is on one side we have the males, and on the other side we have the females. Do you notice any patterns there?
Tend to be more female,
Especially when you get to those countries that have larger post-reproductive populations. The females greatly outnumber the males as you get into the older age groups. 80 plus up there at the top. It's getting very skewed, right? All right, let's talk about that. And so the sex ratio is your ratio of males to females. This is another one of those places where the textbook is going to give you, it's going to give you exceptions too, to be fair to the textbooks, but they're going to tell you sexually reproducing populations tend to be 1-to-1. But it's real easy to think of exceptions right off the bat. Lions, for example. The sex ratio is not 1-to-1. Male lions, most male lions don't survive into adulthood. And female lions have a much greater chance. And so when you have a pride, it's all females, and how many males? One, right? And so it's easy to find exceptions to this. The argument is just coming about because you need one male and one female in order to have sex and have offspring. And there's lots of populations that are going to be close to that. So if you have a territorial bird species, if you've had ornithology, you know they cheat on each other a lot, but you still tend to have one male and one female at that nest, right? So it tends to be around 1-to-1. But it gets more complicated than that. And so we're going to talk about some different ones. So primary sex ratio is the ratio at conception. So the ratio at conception means before they're even born. So we're talking about when the sperm fertilizes the egg. The sex ratio at conception tends to be 1-to-1. We can do our Punnett square, right? Remember those things? So you have X, X, that's your female, that's mom, X, Y is the male. And if you do a Punnett square, you should have 50-50, right? 50-50 chance of having a male and female. So at conception, that tends to hold. So that's your primary sex ratio. Sex ratio, secondary sex ratio, is at birth. So of all the eggs that got fertilized, what do you actually have when you have a litter? That's kind of, you have to get away from humans. We don't usually have litters. There are some examples. But generally speaking, we don't have litters. What's kind of interested in is in mammals, the secondary sex ratio is weighted towards males. So at conception, we're usually 1-to-1, but in the litter, there's usually a bias towards males. And so we've got some stats here. Let me get them up there. There we go. You don't have to remember the stats, but just to give you some idea. So we have some work that they did on elk in Western Canada, and the ratio of fetuses, so before they were born, was 113 males to 100 females. So it's already showing that bias. And then that switches rapidly after birth, so that by the time they're 1.5 to 2.5, you got 85 males to 100 females.
So it's weighted towards the males to die.
Maybe. As far as I know, I'm not a molecular biologist here. We don't really understand what causes that bias in the secondary sex ratio in mammals, but it is consistent. And that's a pretty big difference in the ratio of fetuses, 113 to 100. All right, in birds, the sex ratio tend to remain weighted towards males. And that probably has to do with the fact that the females lay the egg outside their body. They tend to do, in most species, because you remember we're making a generalization here. In many species, the female also does most of the incubating. And so just the stress of laying the eggs in birds tends to be much harder on the female, of course, than the male. And that's probably what's driving that. And so you don't see, if you look at an older bird population, you'd see more males than females. If you look at an older mammal population, you're going to see more females than males. That's what that's trying to say. All right, let's look at some human stats. It's kind of interesting. And so from 0 to 4 years old, we've got more males than females in our population, about 104 to 100. It's not strong, but it's consistent. When we're 40 to 44, it's about 1-to-1, so one male for one every female. And then it takes a header after about that, right? So it's by 60, we're 88 males to 100 females, and by 80 years old, about 54. It's about half as many males as females. And so why is this happening? Well,
Males are dumber.
well, there is that. Women don't
That's
tend
correct.
to do these things. we really don't. But here's two possibilities that we'll discuss. One has to do with our sex chromosomes. And so females have XX, like I drew on the board. Those are two complete, rather large chromosomes. And they're going to be able to match up and work like the other chromosomes in your body. So you have an allele on this one that matches up with an allele on this one, and then you get your phenotype, whatever that happens to be. In males, you get one large X chromosome and one itty bitty teeny tiny Y chromosome. And so it doesn't match up with the X chromosome. And so whatever happens on the X chromosome is going to be expressed, because the Y chromosome is mostly information about what makes the embryo become a male, like the release of testosterone during development, that kind of thing. So probably in freshman biology you learned about some stuff like men are more likely to be colorblind than women, because if their mother is heterozygous and carries the colorblind gene, you got a 50-50 chance if you're a son to get it from your mother. Whereas if the dad has normal vision and the mother's a heterozygote, that puts you at only like a 25% chance, I think. Did I do that right? For the female, for a woman. No, you're not. That's a 0% chance because your dad's got the normal gene. So I didn't do that right. Because you're going to get the healthy colorblind gene from your dad. It's the same for, oh, here it comes. It's coming. It's hemophilia, right? The clotting agents. There are clotting agents that are on the X chromosome that sometimes the guys, or more often the guys, are going to get some problems with hemophilia than women. And all you can see here, so that's the first part, more likely to show some recessive traits. And they also think the lack of that second X chromosome may lead to make you more susceptible to disease and stress and aging than females are. The second is what that picture's about, right? There are some behavioral differences between males and females. Males are more likely to be aggressive and take risks than females. Remember, this is on average. It's not talking about the individual. We all know aggressive females and we all know timid males. That's just the way it is. But on average, that's the way it works. To the point that insurance companies require what of young men versus young women?
Higher rates.
Yeah, more money. Because statistically, a young man is more likely to get into an automobile accident than a young woman. Y'all seem to be aware of this, but one time I was talking about this in my freshman class, and one person was just like, women pay less? I mean, they just didn't know. It's like, yeah, they do. But that's the way that insurance companies work, because if you make good grades, you are also statistically less likely to get in an accident, and so you can get a discount if you make good grades. Right? There's other things that can contribute to, other behavioral things that they can measure about you that can contribute to whether or not they think that you're going to be a risk. Because ultimately, does the insurance company want to pay out? No. So that's where that's all coming from. That shows up not just in their behavior, in male behavior, but also in physiology. And so men tend to have less blood vessels near the surface than females, which means if they get cut or bruised, then they are going to bleed less. That's part of their territorial behavior. It's a physiological difference you might not have thought about, and so forth. In birds, the territorial defense is shared between them, and then also the male is the one that has the two chromosomes. They have reverse chromosome stuff than we do. And so you don't see the same type of patterns in birds. All right. Any questions about why men die early?
In terms of like other non-avian reptiles, there are like other like factors that cue into like their secondary like birth sex ratio, like temperature dependent.
Yes, there are species that's the egg can change sex depending on the temperature, or the sex is determined by the temperature. And then there are some species in which an adult can change sex depending on the sex ratio in the population. So it's always more complicated than what you're going to get in a text or class.
That's so interesting.
So again, I want to give you a practical example of where these types of things come into play. And so over the last, well, I'll probably have a date in there at some point, but 4 years or so, we have been working with eastern bluebird mortality. And I'm just going to run through some of these slides fairly quickly. This is a presentation that Autumn gave last spring when she was finishing up her scholar's thesis, so it's pretty detailed. This is just some background. You can see some pictures of the eastern bluebirds. The male is on the lid, the female's up at the top. She's not quite as blue as he is. In the winter, they are omnivores. However, they really prefer arthropods, right? So if they had their choice, they would be insectivores. But during the winter time, when that becomes less available, they will eat berries and things like that. And they are able to sustain themselves through cold weather pretty well, even fairly severe cold snaps. But they are not able to get food when we have snow or ice cover. And so that picture is showing you some berries covered in ice. That becomes inaccessible to bluebirds. And so another thing we need to know is that they tend to use cavities, and they roost communally in the cavities during cold weather to share their energy, keep themselves warm, essentially. And they tend to roost with their flock. And so whoever they're flying with during the day, which is usually some males, some females, and some youngs of the year, so like family units, plus probably a little bit more, that's who they're going to go to sleep with in the evenings. And so in the winter, when we have severe weather, we sometimes see mass mortality events. Okay, not always, but sometimes. And so some of the reasons for this might be just overcrowding, like the ones at the bottom just get smushed or smothered. They could be that they dwindle their fat reserves and they just starve. They can't sustain themselves through a cold winter night, even with the heat of their other birds in the box with them. Or they could be spreading things like diseases and parasites. And so there is a couple by the name of Bob and Judy Peaks that have been monitoring bluebird boxes at Land Between the Lakes and Lake Barkley Resort, I think it is, for the last 30 years or so. And they've given us their whole data set, which is really nice. We have that. And then they have recorded 3 of these really major winter storms where they found mortalities in their nest boxes. And so in 2014, they found 69 winter-killed eastern bluebirds. In 2015, they had 24 eastern bluebirds that had been killed. And all of those birds came to UT Martin. And Dr. Pitts, the retired ornithologist, did some of the same type of thing that we did. He aged them, sexed them in particular, and that information was published in the journal, which is called the Bluebird. In both of these winter storms, what you had was a cold period, but that cold period also had extensive ice and snow. All right. If it's just a cold period, they do fine. We had a cold over Christmas, not this Christmas, I think it was the Christmas before, in which in Martin anyway, we had rolling blackouts because we were pulling too much energy, it was so cold. No dead bluebirds in the nest boxes. There was no snow cover. They were fine. It's really when you get that snow cover that you have a problem, okay? And so for us, what happened in 2021 is we had a big polar vortex and we had a whole week in which there was snow and ice on the ground along with cold weather. And they found, and they became interested in the causes of mortality of these birds. And so as soon as they could get to the boxes, they went in and got the birds, which they hadn't done in the past. In the past, those birds were discovered in the spring when they were cleaning out the boxes. And so they made an effort to try to get there fairly quickly after the snowstorm had ended, and the roads were passable. And they found 90 dead bluebirds in the boxes. Dr. Pitts had retired, and so he put them into contact with me, and I was like, sure, why not? So I inherited 90 dead bluebirds, and we got a lot out of them. And so we determined their sex, their age, we weighed them, and then we wanted to see if we could figure out what some of the possible causes of death were. And so the first thing we did was determine sex. That's pretty easy. They're sexually dimorphic. So for the most part, it's pretty easy, even amongst the dead birds, if you've got good lighting, to see the male versus the female. And so we looked at the sex ratios, and there is an interesting pattern here. A lot of what we did, Dr. Pitts wrote a whole book about eastern bluebirds, and he studied the eastern bluebird populations in West Tennessee for many, many, many years. And so a lot of what we did is we looked to see what his banding data said, and then we compared that to what we found in the nest boxes. And so his banding data showed a 1-to-1 sex ratio. And so we did a chi-square and we compared the sex ratios that we found amongst the 90 dead bluebirds to a 1-to-1 sex ratio. And what we found was that more males were found dead in the nest boxes than females, consistently in all 3 of these events. Okay? And so why did that happen? Well, honestly, as you read through this slide, we don't know. We don't know why more males are found dead in the nest boxes. One idea might be maybe they're not 1-to-1, but we have pretty good data to show that they should be close to 1-to-1 sex ratio. One could be maybe the males don't gain as much weight, don't have as many fat reserves as the females. But Dr. Pitts did quite a bit of winter research on eastern bluebirds, and they gain weight at the same rate, so there shouldn't be any difference there in terms of their winter weight gain. One idea might be maybe the males roost here and the females roost somewhere else, but there's no evidence for that. They roost as a flock. Whoever they're with all day, that's who they're with. So we don't really know, but it is consistent, so it's interesting. We have to ask. That's a question that we weren't able to really answer. Then we aged them, looking at age ratios, and we did that by looking at the intensity and symmetry of the blue pigment in the 10th primary covert. Primary is the flight feather, and so this is the first, it's actually the 10th, as you can see here, but it's the first one. If you have the wing, it's the first one at the top. That's the 10th primary feather. And so this is just a little feather that sits on top of it. You can see that 7's got it where you pulled up so you can see it up there. And so what 7 did is they clipped the 10th primary on both sides, and then we pressed them between slides. So we have all of them. If anybody wants to go and check our work, we have all of them. And then determined their age based on that. And we were able to age all but 2 of them. So we have the age on 88 of the 90. That's pretty consistent with this particular method. By the way, this method was invented by Dr. Pitts himself in his publication, and he came and taught us how to use it. So that's great. And when somebody checked his method, that's about right. We did pretty well. You're not able to age every single one. And so we were able to age confidently 88 of them. And so these words up here, SY is a second year bird, but the way that we age birds is weird. And so if they were hatched in the summer, and then these were found dead after January 1st, even though they're not a full year old, they're in their second year of life. And so that's the young birds, essentially. Okay, those are the ones that just this is their first winter. After second year means that this is at least their second winter. So second winter or more, all right? And so what we found there was there really wasn't much difference than what we would expect based on the ratio of young and old birds in Dr. Pitt's banding data. Okay, and so it didn't seem like the young ones were dying at a higher rate or the old ones were dying at a higher rate. Okay, so there was no difference there. Then we did something that Dr. Pitts didn't do. So we only have data on weight from our birds, the 90 that we collected that were given to us. But we did weigh each specimen, and we would note that they had been in the freezer and they had been in the nest boxes during the storm, and so it's likely that they did lose some water weight, and so kind of keep that in mind. But a healthy bluebird should weigh around 34 grams during the winter. This is Dr. Pitt's data again on what bluebirds weigh throughout the year. Their weight peaks around December. And the ones that we measured on average weigh 21 grams. That's pretty light, even if you accounted for the amount of moisture that they might have lost. They were put in the freezer rather quickly. Once they were in the freezer, they were in Ziploc bags. They shouldn't have lost that much at that point. We didn't find any difference between males and females or between the ages either. And so everybody weighed too little, right? They didn't weigh enough. And so we decided to look and see if we could figure out if they had been eating and what had they been eating. And so this is Autumn's part of the project. Autumn removed the digestive tract. Birds have a 2-chambered stomach. So they have a proventriculus, which is the glandular part. That's the first part it enters. And then the ventriculus is better known as the gizzard. It's the muscular part that does the grinding. And so we removed all of that. And then she would cut along the side and open it up. And when she opened it up, she would categorize what she found. And so we had categories for seeds, seed coating, plant fibers, whole arthropods, arthropod parts. She did find some microplastics, and then some unknown where we didn't know exactly how to categorize them. As we're looking at this data, keep in mind that the bluebirds are really highly going to prefer arthropods. That's what they should be eating the majority of the time. But what we found is that's not what they were eating the majority of the time, or at least that's not what we were finding in their gut. Mostly we're finding plant fibers and seed coatings, and then we did find some seeds and a few arthropod parts. All right. So even the plant fibers and seed coatings aren't really great indicators of them getting very good meals. Right? Really, we'd like to see lots of seeds and lots of arthropods inside there. Taking a closer look at it, these are the types of seeds that we found. Sumac, wild rose, greenbrier being up at the top. These birds, because they were at the bottom of the nest box, had seeds collected in their feathers, and then some of that fell into the Ziploc bags. And so Autumn and Natalie combed those out and collected all those seeds. And then if you know Courtney, that's what Courtney's doing right now. She's going through those seeds to get us an idea of what they're doing as well. And so the bluebirds themselves, when they get in their nest boxes, they will deposit. They'll do droppings in their nest boxes overnight. And so the lack of food in their stomach, you could take a few different ways. Like I would expect them to have some remnants left. Like everything's not going to pass through that quickly, right? Anyway, hopefully when we get Courtney's information that she's working on and we combine it with what we found inside their stomachs, we'll get a good picture of what they were eating, consuming, essentially. The other thing that Autumn did is she ranked their fullness from completely empty, meaning there was nothing that she could find in there, to almost empty, which is A, moderately full, which is B, and then completely full, which is C. All right. The majority of them were either empty or ranked 1. So they didn't have a lot of stuff in them to start with. And they didn't differ based on sex or age class. And so this one shows you, the main thing I'd like for you to pay attention here is the green colors. I used green colors for plants and brownish colors, brown yellows for animals. The vast majority of what we found was plant. Okay, not ideal for these species. And so did they starve? We can't say whether they did or didn't. Right? We can't really, based on the data we collected. They typically do feed before going in to roost at night. They were underweight. They didn't have a lot of food in their guts. And so there is pretty good evidence that they were struggling at the very least, right? One of the things we did not expect, though, is when we opened them up, is we found lots of blood, which we really, really didn't expect. And we found it right away. And so 81% of the stomachs that we opened, 81% of the 90 stomachs had blood in it. And there was no differences between the sexes and age classes. It was indiscriminate as to who had blood. And so we started to ask, what could that mean? And so starvation itself can actually cause bleeding. And so it could just be another indicator that they were malnourished at the time that they died. But it could also indicate an infection of some sort, like a parasitic infection, fungal infection, bacterial infection, and so forth. And so another thing that we did is we removed the intestines. And we sent the intestines to Georgia Gwinnett College, where a guy I went to grad school with, he's a parasitologist. His undergraduate research students went through and looked for parasites and identified them to the lowest taxa that they could. And they found that about 49% of them had a parasite called Capillaria, which is the top picture. And then there's a couple of others, minor ones that they found here and there. Capillaria can cause some problems in bluebirds if they're in high numbers. You can see one of them had 42 in their intestines. That's pretty high. Probably they were not the cause of death, except maybe that 42, who knows, right? But generally speaking, having parasites is normal for a wild organism. But what parasites can do is you share nutrition with them. And so if they're already struggling to get enough food because of the snow, then having a higher load of parasites can contribute to the death, right? So this could be a contributor, and we were able to show that they did have parasite loads. The loads did not differ between male and females or age. Again, we got lots of that, like, no different stuff. That's okay. The other thing we did is we got interested in bacterial enteritis, specifically a Clostridium type of infection, and so we paired up with Dr. Hoosman on this part. And they took some samples, swabbing the, originally I think they swabbed the ventriculus, and then later they swabbed both the proventriculus and the ventriculus. And initially we didn't find, so you just see those white little colonies on the plate there, we didn't find any type of Clostridial infection. However, when they expanded and changed the assay we were doing, we got one positive. So at least one of them had a Clostridium type of infection. Also not uncommon for birds to have that, but it would contribute to their overall health. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one. But that one's kind of continuing to, Dr. Hoosman thinks that because they sat in the nest box for quite some period of time, it's likely that the rate of infection is probably higher, but it's harder to detect because a lot of the bacteria would have died in that process, in the freezing process and whatnot. So in conclusion, we think that it's likely a combination of factors that's killing these birds. We do have 2 outgoing projects, Courtney's I've already mentioned, but we also removed the livers from all 90 birds, and all 90 livers are currently at Lincoln Memorial University, where one of my friends does blood parasites, and they are hoping to have the blood parasite analysis done by November, so we'll know if they have avian malaria, for example, things like that, to couple with the parasite information we had from the other school. And then we'll get all of this stuff together and hopefully put it to a giant publication. But all of this has to do with demography, which is what our topic is right now in this class, right? Age ratios, sex ratios, how is all of this changing? We're about to go into life tables, and this is a really nice transition into life tables, which are going to be predicting things about mortality and survivorship. And so, like I said, we have nest box data going out for several years. And so if you look at the winter kills, here's the 2 storms Dr. Pitts worked with, where they had 69 winter kills and then 24 found in the nest boxes. Here is the number of fledglings they had from those boxes prior to the storm. Here's the first big winter storm, knocked them back, and then of course, then it knocked it back again. So it is having a big impact on their demography overall. They tend to bounce back pretty good. So here's the year before the winter polar vortex. They had about 1,800. They're also adding nest boxes. We probably should add that, but they had a few more nest boxes, so about 1,813 fledglings. In the year prior to the event that killed the 90 birds, 526 the next spring. That's a huge impact on their demography. But the good news is, again, they tend to bounce back from these events fairly quickly. All right. Any questions about anything like that? So I guess. So what can we do? We recommend monitoring blueback bird boxes throughout the winter, so we can get a better information about winter mortality. Most of these boxes are put up, they're monitored all summer and then ignored in the winter. And then planting native berries and fruits that match what we found in their guts and in the nest boxes is a good idea to help them sustain themselves through these cold spells. And then I've already told you our future research. This was a huge project, and so I don't think it's a big surprise. There's lots of people to acknowledge here. Lots of people worked on it. This is my favorite slide, though. Y'all have any questions about anything about that? So it's been a massive endeavor. So what I want to do on Monday is I'm going to go over, it's like 4 slides. It's really not much. But they are some important concepts I want you to kind of work into your brain before we talk about life tables. And then the rest of the time, so that won't take very long, like 10 minutes maybe. And then the rest of the time, bring me questions, anything you have that you need to ask me about before that exam. We can review it. We have time to do that. And then the exam on Wednesday. Okay? All right. Break.